If you were to sum him up, what words come to mind?
Messianic, ruthless.
I think he's really very focused on control, right? He's very focused on control over the party, control over the country.
Us turning more towards authoritarianism under Xi Jinping. He has centralized the power around him.
If there's one thing you know about Xi Jinping, it's that since coming to power, he's concentrated control of China more closely into his hands. It's a common talking point in Western media, most of the time with a degree of alarm. But if I were to ask you how President Xi has grabbed all of this power, would you be able to give any specific examples? You might know a bit about the anti-corruption campaign, or you might know that social credit meme, but I'm guessing that most wouldn't be able to point to specific examples. And that's not anyone's fault. Western media has little incentive to focus on the domestic policy of China. But we're here to help you out today, so stick around as we walk you through the social, political, and economic controls that Xi has placed over China to put him in the elusive position of rivaling the power once held by Mao Zedong. Okay, so the first thing that you need to know about Xi Jinping is how deeply haunted he is by the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm so deeply haunted by how many of you watching aren't subscribed, so like and subscribe. It's free to do and you have nothing to lose. Also, let me know below who will end up the more highly revered leader of China, Xi or Mao. But basically, the fall of the Soviet Union has played a huge role in shaping Xi's philosophy and has ensured that he rejects any sort of political liberalization to have a Western-style government. Now, for context, the rejection of political liberalization didn't begin with Xi. As Kevin Rudd points out, in 2001, China conducted an internal report into whether it should transition to a social democracy, and with the fall of the Soviet Union 10 years earlier, the party adamantly rejected it. So know that the move away from any sort of political liberalization didn't actually begin with Xi. So basically, when the party was controlled by Deng Xiaoping, Deng outsourced political control to bureaucrats and gave much economic power to the private sector. He famously said that some would get rich first and that what he was doing was socialism with Chinese characteristics. For Xi Jinping, he's concerned that China has more Chinese characteristics than actual socialism, and that these characteristics are just corporate capitalism. With this, Xi's very concerned that some private companies have grown to be so powerful that they threaten the authority of the party, and that China's becoming as inequitable a society as the West is. However, that's not to say that Xi doesn't believe in the importance of having socialism with actual Chinese characteristics. Whereas nationalism is considered a heresy in Marxist-Leninism, Xi has embraced Chinese nationalism. Since 2012, much of the party's messaging has been about the Communist Party continuing the great and powerful Chinese dynasties, and he's even sought to rehabilitate Confucianism, which by being a religion was once seen as anti-communist in China. For Xi, the bottom line is that China's greatness across its historical dynasties has been an authoritarian and hierarchical government. So, the first obvious way in which Xi Jinping has tightened his grasp on power since becoming the party's general secretary in 2012 is with his anti-corruption campaign. Now, it is important to note that some sort of anti-corruption drive was commonplace for the new Chinese leader. Both Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin had launched similar campaigns at the beginning of their terms. However, Xi Jinping's was on a much larger scale. For example, Hu Jintao had only targeted his campaign at lower-ranking officials known as flies, whereas Xi also went after high-ranking officials known as tigers. In 2014 alone, there were 71,000 disciplinary cases with 23,000 charges, and since 2014, over 100,000 people have been indicted for corruption. Of particular interest is the case of Zhou Yongkang, who was a factional enemy of Xi's. He was found guilty of taking 130 million yuan in bribes. Now, I'm not trying to be entirely cynical here. Mass corruption was real, and it was a huge issue for economic growth. Not to mention that nepotistic corruption risked incompetent party officials bribing their way to the top. Secondly, in 2017, Xi Jinping had Congress amend the constitution to include Xi Jinping thought as one of the three main additions to the party's interpretation of communism. Interestingly, his predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, have their own contributions, but they're ranked lower than Deng and Mao's. And so the message was clear. Xi Jinping was to be considered at least equal to Deng Xiaoping, and perhaps even on par with Mao. Now, Xi Jinping thought isn't a closed canon. It's evolving with every speech and article, but what it means is that Xi Jinping's words are always the official position of the party. Now, just last week, we saw that this isn't the case for the American president. After Joe Biden said America would commit to defending Taiwan if invaded, White House officials walked it back afterwards.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. A White House official later tried to walk those comments back, insisting there isn't a change in policy toward Taiwan.
So the party responds to Xi's agenda rather than vice versa. Also, in 2018, Xi Jinping was made the president for life. Now, the title of president in China is the head of the National Congress and is largely ceremonial. True power comes through being the general secretary of the party. But recently, China has given the title of president to the general secretary as a way of recognizing their authority. Now, Deng Xiaoping implemented 2-term limits to ensure the smooth transition of power, but in 2018, these were abolished, meaning that Xi could now be in power beyond his term's end date in 2023. So one of the main components of Xi Jinping thought is the China Dream, which has 2 key goals. The first goal is to become what Xi describes as a moderately prosperous society, basically doubling China's GDP per capita from $5,000 to $10,000 within roughly a decade from 2010. This they achieved in 2021. The second part of the China Dream is becoming a fully advanced economy. Basically, the goal is for China to have the same GDP per capita as America by 2049, the centenary of the Communist Party coming to power. And this is where it gets a bit tricky for Xi. Throughout the 21st century, employment growth has come through the private sector rather than the state-owned enterprises, which have become more of a liability than an asset. And this push for economic growth, even if it means increased privatization, is supported by key players within the party such as Liu He, Wang Yan, and Wang Qishan. For them, stagnation is the ultimate sin and they want to avoid it at all costs. And so for President Xi, this is where 2 of his visions seemingly conflict. Xi's China Dream is all about economic growth, yet he wants to contain the private firms to minimize their power. So, how's he navigated that conflict so far? Well, party secretaries have been given expanded roles within private firms, and the party has been weighing up whether it buys equity within China's largest companies. In fact, China's entrepreneurs seem to have become concerned that the Communist Party is putting a growth cap on them to prevent them from becoming too large. For example, the party cracked down on Jack Ma with Alibaba and Ant Group, as Xi personally ordered a last-minute suspension of Ma's $35 billion public offering on the Chinese stock market. Not to mention that in 2018, Anbang Insurance was temporarily controlled entirely by the party when its CEO was arrested. In terms of exerting control, Xi has been successful so far, but he does run the risk of China's major companies transferring their capital elsewhere in fear of future market conditions. So, in terms of social control, we're going to look at 3 main areas: education, religion, and technology. And so in 2014, Xi Jinping began his crackdown on the supposed bourgeois liberalization of China's education system. As part of this crackdown, there were several areas that were no longer to be of academic discussion: free speech, civil rights, civil society, historical errors of the party, crony capitalism, and judicial independence. Xi also went further, banning private tuition, private schooling, foreign teachers, and international textbooks. It's also interesting to note that just like Putin, Xi Jinping identified US interference as the primary influence in the 2011 Arab Spring, in which several authoritarian Arab states fell. As a result, in 2017, Xi instituted the NGO law, in which increased security restrictions were placed on all foreignly funded non-government organizations. Secondly, when it comes to religion, Xi has attempted to use coercion to sinify foreign religions, mainly Islam and Christianity. Basically, Protestant Christianity went through an explosion of growth in the 21st century. The danger for Xi was that this was all happening outside of the nationally controlled Chinese church, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Accordingly, in 2016, Xi addressed the National Religious Work Conference, saying that religions ought to act appropriately within China. A huge series of demolition of unauthorized churches then proceeded. Finally, this 12th century Chinese proverb rings in the ears of President Xi: "The mountains are high and the emperor is far away." Chinese emperors had long experienced the issue of ruling a vast people and territory. However, in the era of technology, bringing the corners of the Middle Kingdom under Xi's rule is now more achievable. Alibaba's Alipay and Tencent's WeChat Pay have made China a largely cashless society with all transactions traceable. Xi's used this to monitor the activities of cadres, mainly for corruption. And so finally, with the social credit system, Xi has used it to monitor the behavior of potential dissidents. Now, I do think this system often gets blown a little out of proportion. It actually started in a trial format in 2009 before Xi rose to power, and it's largely applied to criminal or financial behavior rather than politically incorrect activity. A low social credit score may result in harder access to loans, low internet speeds, or loss of job. However, as you might have expected, Xi has demonstrated some interest in this becoming a tool to monitor political patterns and keep tabs on all potential dissidents. And that's about all I have on how Xi Jinping has attempted to concentrate first his own power within the party and then the party's power within China. He could stay in power as late as 2035, and so I'm sure at some point I'll be making part 2 of this video, but don't forget to let me know whether it will be Xi or Mao who will go down as the most revered leader of China. I'm curious to know your thoughts, and of course make sure to like and subscribe, it helps us get the content out. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.